Florence Lockhart had ridden 4 states with a dead man's promise stitched into the lining of her coat, and her mother's gold ring pressed so hard against her palm that she could feel the engraving even through her riding gloves. And she was not going to cry. Not here. Not in front of a town she had never seen before. Not when the stage had barely rolled to a stop in the red dust of Redemption Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1878. She stepped down from the Concord coach with the careful dignity of a woman who had learned that composure was the only currency that could not be stolen from you. Her skirts were road dusty, and her dark hair had come half loose from its pins somewhere around the Utah border, but her chin was level, and her green eyes were clear, and she clutched her carpet bag against her side like a woman who had long since stopped trusting the world to hold on to things for her. The town of Redemption Creek was the kind of place that looked like it had been dropped there by accident. A single main street of sun-bleached buildings ran along a creek that was barely more than a whisper of water between flat rocks. There was a general store, a livery, a hotel that needed paint, a saloon whose sign was only half nailed up, and the stage office, where a boy of about 12 was sweeping the porch with the slow indifference of someone who had nowhere better to be. A handful of horses were tied to the rail outside the saloon, their tails flicking at flies in the late afternoon heat. Florence set her bag down on the boardwalk and looked up and down the street. She had crossed Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, and now Nevada on the word of a man named George Calloway, who had written to her in Memphis 7 months ago and told her he was running a good cattle operation outside Redemption Creek, and that he admired a capable woman and would she consider coming west to be his wife. She had written back twice, cautiously. He had sent her a train fare and a stagecoach ticket and a date. He had not been at the Elko station when her stage stopped there 4 days ago, and he was not here now. She had known, somewhere in the marrow of her, since Elko. But she had carried herself the remaining miles anyway, because her mother had raised her to finish what she started, and because the ring, her mother's ring, thin gold with a small rose cut into it, was meant to be a wedding ring if things went well, or a symbol of everything she had risked if they did not. Either way, she had promised herself she would arrive. She was 24 years old. She had buried her mother in Memphis in the spring, and sold the boarding house they had run together, and decided that the life she had known was finished. George Calloway had seemed like a door opening. Now she stood in the dust of Redemption Creek, Nevada, wondering if the door had been painted on a wall all along. The stage driver, a wide man named Burl who smelled of tobacco and leather, had climbed down and was already hefting trunks from the boot. He did not look at Florence with any particular sympathy. He had seen women come west on men's promises before. The boy with the broom had stopped sweeping and was staring at her with open curiosity. Florence picked up her bag. She would need to ask at the hotel about George Calloway. She would need to find out if he even existed in the way he had claimed to exist. She squared her shoulders and began walking toward the hotel, and it was precisely then that a man stepped out of the stage office doorway and nearly collided with her. He caught her arm to steady her, stepped back immediately, and removed his hat. He was perhaps 28, lean and sun-darkened in the way of men who worked outdoors, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of good creek water. A clear, changing hazel that seemed to catch the afternoon light differently depending on which way he turned. He wore a plain work shirt, worn at the elbows, and a vest that had seen better years, and his boots were the boots of a man who spent his days in them rather than dressing them up for town. He was not remarkable in the way that men in stories are remarkable, all broad and golden and immediately obvious. He was the kind of remarkable that sneaks up on you, the kind you notice only after you have already been looking for a while. "Pardon me," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried. "I should have watched where I was going." "No harm done," Florence said, and she meant to walk around him and on toward the hotel, but something in his expression stopped her. He was looking at her with a particular attentiveness, not rudely, but the way a man looks when he recognizes something he was not expecting to see. "Are you the woman from the Memphis stage?" he asked. Florence looked at him steadily. "I am the woman who arrived on the stage from Elko, yes. And who are you?" "Samuel Rhodes," he said. He turned his hat in his hands once, a brief nervous gesture he seemed not to be entirely aware of. "I work at the Calloway spread. Or I did until last month." Florence felt the words settle on her like cold water. "Until last month," she repeated carefully. Samuel Rhodes met her eyes without flinching. "Ma'am, I think you'd better come inside out of the sun. There are things you need to know about George Calloway, and I'd rather not say them in the middle of the street." She could have walked away. She could have gone to the hotel and made her own inquiries. But there was something in the directness of him, something that was neither pity nor calculation, that made her decide to trust the next 10 minutes. She followed him into the stage office, which smelled of ink and sawdust and old paper, and sat in the chair he offered her. Samuel Rhodes did not sit. He stood by the window with his hat in his hands and told her the truth in the plainest language he could find, which she would later think was one of the finest gifts anyone had ever given her. George Calloway had left Redemption Creek 6 weeks ago. He had sold the cattle, taken the proceeds, and ridden south with a woman from the saloon whose name was Clara something or other, and nobody in town expected him back. He had left debts behind, a half-finished house on 60 acres of scrub, and a reputation that the town had been quietly reassessing for some time. Samuel Rhodes had worked his cattle operation for 3 years as a ranch hand, and had left when Calloway stopped paying wages, which had happened 2 months before Calloway himself disappeared. Samuel had stayed in Redemption Creek because he had nowhere pressing to go, and because he had been picking up work where he could find it, and because he had heard from Burl the stage driver that a woman was arriving from Memphis on the Calloway ticket, and he had thought she ought to know what she was arriving to before she walked into it alone. Florence listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap, and her mother's ring pressing against her palm through the leather of her glove. When Samuel Rhodes finished speaking, the room was quiet for a moment except for the sound of the street outside and the distant hammer of someone working in the livery. "Thank you," Florence said. She said it with complete sincerity. "Most men would have let me find out on my own." "Most men," Samuel said quietly, "are not always at their best." She looked at him for a moment. "What do I owe you for this information?" Something shifted in his expression, something between surprise and something gentler. "Not a thing," he said. "It was only right." Florence nodded. She stood up, smoothed her skirts, and picked up her bag. "Then I will go to the hotel and determine what my options are." "Thank you, Mr. Rhodes." "Samuel," he said, and then seemed mildly surprised that he had said it but did not take it back. She paused at the door. "Florence," she said, and walked out into the sun. The hotel was run by a woman named Agnes Vickers, who was perhaps 55 and had the weathered competence of someone who had outlasted a great many problems. She gave Florence a room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the creek, took one look at her face, and brought her a cup of strong tea without being asked, which Florence considered nearly a miracle. Florence sat on the edge of the hotel bed and took off her gloves and opened her left hand and looked at her mother's ring. It was a simple thing, gold worn thin with 30 years of wearing, with a small rose carved into the band that you had to look closely to see. Her mother, Florence Lockhart, had worn it every day of her adult life, and had slipped it off her finger in her final week and pressed it into Florence's hand and said only, "Make something good of your life, Florence. Make something that lasts." She had thought marrying George Calloway was making something good. She had thought the wide western sky and a cattle operation and a man who wrote decent letters would be the foundation of something lasting. She had been wrong in the particulars, but perhaps not entirely wrong in the impulse. She put the ring on her own finger, where it had never sat before. It was loose, and she moved it to her right hand instead, where it fit slightly better. She did not cry. She was too tired for crying and too practical by nature, And besides, her mother's voice was in her head saying that a woman who could run a Memphis boarding house at 19 could certainly manage a setback in Nevada. She slept, and in the morning she went downstairs and asked Agnes Vickers about employment. Agnes Vickers looked at her over the rim of her spectacles with the expression of a woman who was running calculations. "I need a girl for the kitchen and the rooms," she said. $2 a week and board." "Glamorous." "It's honest," Florence said. "I'll take it." She had been in Redemption Creek for 4 days, working breakfast service in the hotel dining room and cleaning rooms in the afternoons when she next saw Samuel Rhodes. He came in for supper on a Thursday, sat at the end of the long communal table and did not seem surprised to see her working the room. He ordered the beef stew and a cup of coffee and ate quietly, and when she refilled his coffee he said, "Are you all right, truly?" Florence set the coffee pot down on the table and looked at him directly. "I am," she said. "I was angry for about a day. Now I am more interested in what comes next." "That's a practical way to be," he said. "My mother was a practical woman," Florence said. "It got passed down." He looked at her with those Creekwater eyes, and something in his expression was careful and attentive in a way that she found herself noticing more than she intended to. "The boarding house you mentioned in your letter to Calloway," he said. "Did you run it yourself?" She felt a small jolt of surprise. "How do you know about my letters to Calloway?" A slight color came into his face. "He left a box of correspondence at the spread when he went. I was the one who sorted through it to see if there was anything that needed to go to creditors. I saw your name. I read enough to know you were coming. I didn't read more than was necessary." Florence considered this. It was a reasonable explanation and she believed him. "I ran it with my mother until she died," she said. "I was good at it. I liked the work. I like things to run properly." "There's always work in a town like this for a woman who likes things to run properly," Samuel said, and went back to his stew. It was not a grand thing, he said. But she thought about it later, lying in her second-floor room with the sound of the creek outside, and the Nevada stars making their slow way across the window. She thought about how there was something in Samuel Rhodes that was like a level line in an unsteady world. He was plain-spoken without being blunt, honest without being harsh, and he had done her a good turn for no reason except that it was right. She told herself this was merely gratitude. She told herself this while she turned her mother's ring on her right hand in the dark. October settled over Redemption Creek with a welcome drop in temperature, and Florence began to understand the rhythms of the town. It was a ranching community mostly, with some mining claims in the hills to the east that brought in a rough element on Saturday nights. The permanent residents were largely decent people living the ordinary difficult life of the frontier. There was a schoolteacher named Hattie Marsh, who seemed to be the axis around which the community's social life turned. There was a doctor, an elderly man named Beaumont, who had a good reputation and a bad knee. There was a reverend who came through once a month and held services in the hotel dining room. And there was Samuel Rhodes, who had a small arrangement with a neighboring ranch called the Whitmore Place, doing fence repair and breaking young horses, and who came into town 2 or 3 times a week for supplies or work at the livery, and occasionally for supper at the hotel. Florence noticed him the way you notice something that keeps appearing in your peripheral vision, not with alarm, but with the growing certainty that it is worth looking at directly. She learned things about him by degrees. He was from Ohio originally, had come west at 21 looking for land of his own, and had spent 7 years working other men's cattle instead, saving steadily, buying a small piece of land south of town that he was improving slowly. He had no family close by, a sister back in Dayton who sent letters at Christmas. He was 28, he had never been married, and he was the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, the kind of quiet that has thought things through. She learned these things in conversations that happened in the natural way of small-town life, over the communal supper table, on the hotel porch in the cool evenings, when half the town seemed to drift outside after dark, in the general store where they arrived at the same time one Tuesday, and ended up both needing to wait for Joe Pratt to finish a long negotiation with a rancher about saddle soap. "Do you miss Memphis?" Samuel asked her that Tuesday, while they waited. Florence thought about it seriously, the way she always thought about things he asked. "I miss my mother," she said. "The city itself I can take or leave. I think I'm a person who takes their home with them rather than leaving it somewhere." He looked at her in that attentive, unhurried way. "That's a good way to be in the West," he said. "People who need roots already laid down don't usually last. What about you? Do you miss Ohio?" He was quiet for a moment in the considering way she had come to recognize. "I miss the green," he said finally. "It's very green in Ohio in the spring. Nevada's beautiful, but it's a different kind of beautiful. More like something that doesn't care if you're looking." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her somewhat, and she thought that was interesting. It was in November that things shifted in a way that could no longer be called accidental. The Whitmore Ranch held its harvest gathering, which was an annual excuse for the ranching community to come together and eat and dance in the big Whitmore barn. Agnes Vickers closed the hotel kitchen for the evening, and she and Florence both attended, along with most of the town. Florence wore the best dress she had, which was a dark green wool she had brought from Memphis, and she pinned her hair properly for the first time in weeks, and she wore her mother's ring on her right hand. She was not dressing for anyone in particular. She told herself this quite firmly. The barn smelled of hay and lantern smoke, and the good food that a half-dozen women had brought, and someone was playing a fiddle in the corner, and the dancing started before supper was even finished. Florence danced with Joe Pratt from the general store, who was jovial and light-footed, and with the doctor's assistant, a young man named Thomas who blushed every time he spoke, and with a visiting cattle buyer from Carson City who danced well but talked only about cattle prices. She was standing at the refreshment table with a cup of cider when Samuel Rhodes appeared at her elbow. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his hair was combed, his shirt was new or near to it, and he had shaved, which changed his face somehow, made it younger and more exposed. "You look well," he said, and the simplicity of it was more effective than any elaborate compliment. "You shaved," she said, and then wished she had said something more sophisticated, but it was out. A faint smile moved across his face. "I do occasionally." They stood together at the table for a moment in the easy way they had developed, that comfortable side-by-side quiet that she had not known with many people in her life. The fiddle started up again, a slower tune this time. "Would you dance with me?" Samuel asked. He said it simply, without the elaborate courtly bow that some men produced in these situations, and the simplicity of it was somehow more meaningful than ceremony. "Yes," Florence said. She had danced with men before. She had been to dances in Memphis, but dancing with Samuel Rhodes in the Whitmore barn with the lantern swaying and the fiddle playing something that managed to be both merry and a little melancholy was a different thing altogether. He danced carefully, as if he were thinking about it, and his hand at her back was steady and certain, and he did not try to fill all the silence with talking. They danced twice before they separated, and when they did, Florence could feel the warmth of his hand on her back as though it had been branded there. She spent the rest of the evening being entirely sensible and not looking in his direction more than was reasonable. She failed at that last part. Riding back to town on the Whitmore wagon with Agnes and several others, Florence sat with her hands in her lap and her mother's ring between her fingers and thought with considerable clarity that she was in significant danger of falling in love with Samuel Rhodes, and that this would require some careful thought. She thought carefully about it for approximately 4 days, which was how long it took for the next thing to happen. The next thing was that the cattle buyer from Carson City, whose name was Lester Prout, came back through Redemption Creek on his return journey and decided he was very interested in Florence Lockhart. He was perhaps 35, well dressed in the manner of men with money and very certain of their own appeal, and he had come to the conclusion somewhere in the hills east of town that a capable, handsome woman working a hotel in Nevada was an opportunity a smart man ought not to let pass. He invited her to supper. She declined politely. He invited her again. She declined again, less politely. He made the mistake, on his third attempt, of taking hold of her wrist in the hotel dining room in front of 3 other guests, and telling her that a woman in her position ought to be more friendly to a man with prospects. Florence looked at his hand on her wrist, and then looked at his face with an expression that would have made her mother proud. "Mr. Prout," she said, in a voice that was completely level, "if you do not remove your hand in the next 2 seconds, I will remove it for you in a manner you will remember for the rest of your life." He removed his hand. He did it quickly. But he was the kind of man for whom backing down in front of witnesses generated a particular kind of anger. And when Florence went out to the water pump behind the hotel that evening for a bucket of water, he was waiting. He was not violent in the physical sense, not quite, but he was blocking her way, and he was telling her things in a low, unpleasant voice about what he thought of women who made men look foolish. And Florence was calculating her best response when she heard footsteps on the path and Samuel Rhodes appeared from the direction of the livery with his coat over his arm and a bag of grain over his shoulder. He took in the situation with one look. He set the grain down. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "Agnes asked me to tell you the kitchen water pot is ready." There was no such message. He and Florence both knew it. "Mr. Prout," he said, and his voice was still the low, unhurried voice he always used, but there was something in the bottom of it that was not unhurried at all. "I don't believe Miss Lockhart has any further interest in this conversation." Prout looked at Samuel for a long moment with the calculating look of a man determining odds. Samuel was leaner than Prout, but there was something in the way he stood, completely still and completely prepared, that resolved the calculation quickly. Prout made a sound of contempt and walked away toward the front of the hotel. Florence let out a long breath. "Thank you," she said, in the same sincere way she had thanked him the first day. "Although I was managing." "You were," Samuel agreed. "I just thought a second option might be useful." She looked at him in the lantern light that fell from the hotel's back window, his face half in shadow, the Nevada night open and full of stars behind him. "There is no kitchen message, is there?" "No," he said. "You were passing by." "I was," he said, "and then I was not." She held his gaze, and the air between them was doing something that she suspected had been building for several weeks. "Samuel," she said carefully, "what are we doing?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to feel significant. "I've been asking myself that," he said. "I think I have an answer, but I don't want to say it wrong." Florence felt her heart do something she had not given it permission to do. "Then say it carefully," she said. He turned his hat in his hands, that same small, nervous gesture. "I came west to make something of my own," he said. "I've been doing it slowly. I have 40 acres with a good well and a cabin that's weather-tight and a small herd that I'm building year by year. It's not a great deal. But it's mine and it's honest, and I think in 5 years it will be something worth having." He paused. "And when I think about the future I'm building, I keep thinking about it with you in it, which I know is a complicated thing to say given how you came to be here and what you came here expecting, and I don't mean to be another man making you promises he can't back up." Florence looked at him for a long, steady moment. The creek murmured somewhere in the dark. A horse moved in the livery. The stars did what the Nevada stars did, which was everything. "What promises can you back up?" she asked. He met her eyes. "I can promise you honesty," he said, "and steady work and a man who will tell you the truth even when it's inconvenient. I can promise you 40 acres and a weather-tight cabin and a herd that will grow. I can promise you that I think you are the most capable and interesting woman I have met in my 28 years on this earth, and that I have thought about you every day since you stepped off that stage." Florence realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly. "That is a considerable number of things to promise," she said. "I know," he said. "I mean all of them." The sensible thing, she thought, would be to take more time. She had come to Nevada on one man's promise, and it had come to nothing. And here was another man making promises in the lamplight, and any sensible woman would pause and measure and wait. But there was a difference between George Calloway's letters, which had been confident and vague, and never quite specific, and Samuel Rhodes standing in the dust behind the hotel with his hat in his hands, telling her the precise dimensions of what he had and what he felt. Calloway had offered her an idea. Samuel was offering her himself, in the particular and the concrete, including the limitations. She found she trusted the particular and the concrete considerably more. "I'm not the same woman who got off that stage in September," she said. "I was looking for something to belong to. Now I'm building something to belong to, and I find I like that better. If we are going to be more to each other than we are, I need it to grow properly. I need to know the man, not just the feeling." "That's more than fair," Samuel said. He was watching her with an expression that was open in a way she thought probably cost him something, given that he was not by nature a man who showed things easily. "Then know me. I'll make it easy for you." She smiled, and it was a real smile, not the composed public smile she had practiced so long it had become automatic. "Then I think we should start there," she said. He smiled back, and it changed his whole face in the way she had suspected it would, slow and warm and reaching his eyes, and she thought, well, there it is. They started there. November became December in the high desert way, cold nights and blue skies and frost on the creek stones in the morning, and Florence and Samuel walked the frontier of knowing each other with the care and pleasure of two people who have decided to do it properly. He took her riding on a Sunday afternoon, out to his 40 acres south of town, where the land lay open and rust-colored against a sky so wide it seemed architectural. The cabin was small but solidly made. He had built most of it himself over 2 years with a window that faced east so the morning light came in, which he had done deliberately. She walked through each room without saying anything until they were standing in the main room by the fireplace, and then she turned and said, "You built this." "Most of it," he said, "with some help from the Whitmore boys one summer." She put her hand on the stone of the fireplace, which he had laid himself from creek stones, piece by careful piece. There was something in the roughness and the intention of it that moved her in a way she had not expected. "It's good work," she said. "It still needs things," he said. "Another room, better shelving. The barn needs finishing before spring." "Those are solvable things," Florence said. He was watching her from across the room with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was careful and warm and honest all at once. "Yes," he said, "they are." She turned and looked at him across the cabin, the light coming low and gold through the east window, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since Memphis. Not fixed exactly, settled the way a coin finds its level in still water. She told him about her mother on the ride back, the actual story of it, the boarding house in Memphis, the years of steady work, the small dignities they had built together, the illness that came in February and had done its work by April. She told him about packing the boarding house up and selling it, and the particular grief of selling the furniture her mother had chosen piece by careful piece over 20 years. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his great gifts. "She sounds extraordinary," he said when she had finished. "She was ordinary," Florence said. "She was ordinary and she was mine and she did everything right. I think ordinary is the most extraordinary thing there is." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I think you're right," and it was simple enough to be a complete statement. She showed him the ring that evening, sliding it off her right hand and holding it out so he could see it properly in the last of the afternoon light. He took it carefully, the way men handle things they understand are precious, and turned it so the carved rose caught the light. "It suits you," he said, and handed it back. "My mother wore it 30 years, Florence said. She wanted it to keep going. She looked at it on her own finger for a moment. I think she just wanted the love to keep going." The ring was a symbol of that. Samuel looked at her with an expression that was not careful or measured but simply feeling, unhidden. "The love will keep going," he said quietly. "That's how it works when it's real." She looked up at him. "Have you loved before, truly?" A brief pause, honest rather than evasive. "Once," he said. "Or I thought so. I was 23 and she chose someone with more land and I thought I would not recover. But I think now it was more that I wanted to love someone than that I actually did. It didn't feel like this." "What does this feel like?" Florence asked, because she needed to hear it said. He looked at her for a long, steady moment, and the Nevada evening gathered around them, cold and clear and enormous. "Like finding the thing I was building toward without knowing what it was," he said. "Like all the years of slow and patient work were a kind of practice for something real." She reached out and took his hand, there in the cooling air on the road back to town, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they rode the rest of the way to town like that, side by side, her hand in his, not needing to say any more about it. December deepened. Florence had long since stopped thinking about George Calloway except as a remote curiosity. She had heard through the general store gossip that he had been seen in Arizona, that the woman he had gone with had already left him, that he was making his way through the West on charm and borrowed credit in the way of men with no fixed character. She felt nothing for him but a mild wonder that she had come so far for so little and found something so much better in the rubble. She was still working at the hotel, but Agnes Vickers had promoted her in the informal way of frontier enterprises. She was now managing the kitchen ordering and the room scheduling as well as working service, and there was talk between her and Agnes about a more formal arrangement in the spring. Florence was good at this work. She was good at making things run. She liked the hotel and she liked Redemption Creek, and she found, to her own interest, that she had stopped thinking of Nevada as a place she had landed by accident and started thinking of it as a place she had chosen. Samuel came to supper at the hotel most evenings now, and the town had noticed, which in a small community was its own kind of declaration. Hattie Marsh, the schoolteacher, gave Florence a significant look over the butter dish one morning. Agnes Vickers said nothing, but made sure Samuel's coffee was always hot, and his corner of the table was always available, which was the hotel keeper's version of approval. Christmas came with a cold that settled into the bones of the town, and a thin snow that covered the creek stones in white. The Reverend came through and held his service in the hotel dining room, and afterward there was a communal dinner that Agnes organized and Florence cooked a significant portion of, and the whole town filled the dining room and spilled onto the porch with plates of food and cups of cider, and the particular warmth that a cold, clear night can produce when enough people are glad to be together. Samuel found her in the kitchen after supper, where she was stacking the last of the plates. He had brought her something wrapped in brown paper tied with twine, which he set on the kitchen table with the air of a man who was not entirely certain about the reception it would receive. She dried her hands and unwrapped it. It was a pair of riding gloves, good leather, well made, with a small, careful stitch work at the cuffs in a pattern of running horses. "I thought," he said, with the slight color in his face that she had come to adore, "that you must have worn through the pair you arrived with, given how much riding you've done." Florence looked at the gloves and then looked at him. She had bought him nothing because she had not been certain what would be appropriate and had erred on the side of caution and was now regretting that entirely. "They're beautiful," she said, truthfully. She put them on. "They fit perfectly. How did you know the size?" "I watched your hands," he said, in a completely matter-of-fact way that somehow made it the most intimate thing anyone had ever said to her. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, which was the first time, on the cheek, because it was the kitchen of the hotel and there were 30 people on the other side of the door. He went very still for a moment, and then his hand came up and covered hers where it rested on his arm, and they stood like that for a small quiet moment in the warm kitchen with the cold world outside. "Merry Christmas, Samuel," Florence said. "Merry Christmas, Florence," he said, and his voice was lower than usual and entirely happy. January brought the hardest cold of the winter, the kind that made the mountains look sharp as cut glass against a white sky, and froze the thin edges of the creek, and kept even the most outdoor-oriented residents closer to their fires than they would prefer. Samuel came to town more often during this month, with less immediate purpose, which Florence understood for what it was. One afternoon he came in from a long ride to the eastern property line, where the fencing had been damaged by something, a fallen tree, most likely, and he was colder than she had seen him, and the repair had taken longer than expected. And he came into the hotel smelling of cold air and horse, and wood smoke, and Florence put a bowl of soup in front of him, and sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing in particular. His plans for the spring herd. Her ideas about how the hotel might expand its kitchen operation, a book she had been reading that Agnes had loaned her, the quality of the light in Nevada at different times of year, and whether it was something you could describe or only experience. "I want to read more," Samuel said at one point. "I've always meant to, and somehow the work fills the time." "Then read," Florence said. "The work will still be there." "What do you read?" "My mother kept a good library for a boarding house," Florence said. "She always said that a woman who reads widely can talk to anyone and be afraid of no one." She paused. "I brought 4 books with me from Memphis. I've read them all twice on this trip." "Which 4?" She told him, and he had read one of them, and they spent a considerable time discussing it. And Florence thought that this was one of the clearest signs she had yet encountered that she was making the right decision. That she could sit across a hotel table from this man for 2 hours discussing books and the nature of Nevada light and feel not only happy, but also entirely herself. In February, on a Sunday afternoon when the cold had eased enough to make riding reasonable, Samuel took her out to his land again. He had been working on the barn through the winter weeks when weather permitted, and it was nearly finished now, the new boards bright against the old, the roof solid and fresh. But he had also been doing something else, which she saw when they walked around to the south side of the cabin. He had broken new ground there, a rectangular plot, cleared and turned, clearly waiting for spring. And beside it he had set corner posts for an addition to the cabin, a proper room, larger than the existing ones, with a window frame already in place facing south. Florence stood and looked at this in silence for a moment. She turned to him. He was watching her with those careful, honest eyes and his hat in his hands, which was not a nervous gesture this time but something more like an offering. "I've been thinking," he said, "that a cabin built for a man alone is one thing, and a home built for 2 people is another, and I'd rather be building the second kind." She felt the mother's ring on her right hand, the thin gold and the small carved rose, and heard her mother's voice saying, "Make something that lasts." "Samuel Rhodes," she said, and her voice was steady and warm and entirely certain. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am trying to," he said, "in the best way I know how, which is apparently through carpentry." She laughed, a real full laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and genuine. "I think," she said when she could speak evenly, "that carpentry is an excellent language for it. It shows intent." He stepped forward, close enough that she could see the particular color of his eyes in the afternoon light, that hazel that shifted between green and brown like water. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a ring, a simple silver band, not elaborate, not trying to be more than it was, honest in the way he was honest. "I don't have a great deal," he said. "I have this land and this cabin and the herd and what I can build with my own hands. But I will give you all of it, and I will love you honestly, and I will tell you the truth every day of my life. And I think between the 2 of us we can make something that lasts." Florence took the ring from his hand, and then, deliberately, she took her mother's ring from her right hand and held both rings for a moment in her open palm, the thin worn gold with its carved rose and the plain silver, and thought about her mother wearing the gold ring through 30 years of difficult honest loving, and felt something complete itself in her chest like the last piece of a pattern. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Samuel Rhodes." He put the silver ring on her left hand, and she put her mother's gold ring back on her right hand, and he took both her hands in his, and they stood in the February light on his 40 acres south of Redemption Creek with the Canyon Mountains behind them and the enormous Nevada sky above them. And he kissed her properly for the first time. his hands warm around hers, and it was nothing like any of the things she had imagined marriage might feel like when she was a girl in Memphis. It was better than that. It was specific and real and entirely his. The spring of 1879 came to Redemption Creek with a rush of green along the creek banks and a warmth that felt like relief after the long, cold months. And Florence Lockhart and Samuel Rhodes were married on the 15th of April, which was a Tuesday, in the hotel dining room with the Reverend finally present for a permanent occasion rather than his usual monthly transit, and with the better part of the town filling every chair and spilling out onto the porch. Florence wore the dark green wool dress with new ribbons that Hattie Marsh had helped her add, and her hair was done properly, and she wore her mother's ring on her right hand, and the silver band waited for her left. She had thought about what her mother would say, seeing this moment, and she had decided that a leaner Lockhart would say nothing at all, simply take her daughter's face in both hands and look at her the way she used to when Florence had done something right, and that was enough. Samuel wore a new shirt, dark blue, and a vest that fit him properly for once, and he had his hair cut properly for the second time in Florence's memory, and he stood at the front of the dining room with his hat in his hand and watched her come down the length of the room with an expression that was entirely open and entirely his. Agnes Vickers cried, which surprised everyone including Agnes Vickers. They spoke the words. He put the silver band on her left hand. She put her hand in his. The Reverend pronounced them married and someone started the fiddle, which had been brought inside for the occasion, and the room erupted in the particular joyful noise of a community that has decided a wedding is an occasion for its full enthusiasm. They danced in the hotel dining room, the first dance of their married life, and Samuel was still the careful, deliberate dancer she had discovered at the Whitmore Barn harvest, and she had come to love this about him. The way he paid attention to things, the way even dancing was something he approached with his full presence. "Are you happy?" he said quietly while they danced. "I am the most thoroughly happy I have ever been," Florence said, which was the truth in its entirety. They moved to the cabin on his 40 acres the following week, bringing Florence's things from the hotel, her carpet bag, the 4 Memphis books, her mother's small silver brush set, her good green wool dress that was now a wedding dress. She kept 1 day a week working at the hotel for Agnes through the spring as the transition settled, and then she handed over the kitchen management completely to a woman Agnes had hired and turned her full attention to the land. The South Side addition was finished by late May. A real bedroom with the south-facing window and room for a proper bed, which Samuel had found at the Elko trading post and gotten the Whitmore boys to help carry home in a wagon. Florence put curtains on the window, the first curtains in the cabin's history, and arranged their small pieces on the shelves and tabletops with the same care she had learned from her mother, and the cabin became in small, steady ways a home. She started a kitchen garden in the turned earth beside the addition, which in the high desert required a particular stubbornness about water management. She spent 3 weeks working the soil and building irrigation channels from the creek that ran south of the property, and by early June she had seedlings coming up that she tended with the morning-lit focus of someone who finds deep satisfaction in making things grow. Samuel watched her with this and said one morning, over coffee at the kitchen table with the east light coming in the window he had made for it, "You're going to have the best kitchen garden in the county." "I intend to," Florence said, completely seriously, and he laughed, that warm, slow laugh she had worked to produce all winter and could now usually predict, and she felt entirely pleased with herself. The 40 acres were good land, better than they had initially appeared. There was the reliable well and the creek access, and a pasture section south of the creek that was naturally protected from the worst of the wind. Samuel's herd of cattle, 12 head going into the spring, had produced 3 calves by June, and there were 2 horses and a reliable mule named Gregory who had opinions about everything. The days had a rhythm that Florence found deeply satisfying. not in the frantic, varied way of the hotel, but in the foundational way of things that matter. She woke early and made coffee, and they drank it in the east-facing window light and talked about the day, what needed doing, what could wait, what small thing each of them had noticed that needed attending to. Then the day opened up its requirements and they met them, and in the evenings they sat on the porch or by the fire depending on weather and talked, or she read, and he mended tack or worked on something with his hands, and the quiet of those evenings was the richest kind of quiet, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you are and being glad of it. She wrote to her mother's best friend in Memphis, Mrs. Caldwell, who had helped her pack up the boarding house, and told her everything. And Mrs. Caldwell wrote back in a long, warm letter that made Florence cry in the good way, the kind that feels like being seen. She put the letter in the same drawer where she kept her mother's small photographs, and the Memphis boarding house deed that was now just paper rather than anything live. In July, she went into Redemption Creek for the 4th of July gathering and ran into Hattie Marsh, who was organizing the town's small celebration. And on an impulse, Florence offered to help with the food organization. And before the morning was out, she was effectively running the catering side of the event, which she did with the same efficient pleasure she brought to everything she organized. Samuel came by at midday, ostensibly to pick up supplies from Joe Pratt's store, and found her in the middle of coordinating 20 people and 4 long tables of food with the particular calm of someone in their natural element. He leaned against the store post and watched for a while. "You're in your element," he said, when she had a moment. "I like people when they have something useful to do," she said, handing him a roll from the basket on the table without looking up from her list. "Including myself." He ate the roll and said nothing further but watched her with the expression she now knew meant he was feeling something he thought was too large for current circumstances to contain, and she tucked this observation away to consider later with appropriate pleasure. The summer went on in the way of hard-working summers in the West, full and warm and physically demanding and deeply satisfying. Samuel broke 2 young horses that summer, selling one to a rancher from the next county and keeping one for Florence, a gray mare she named Hazel, for the color of Samuel's eyes on certain days, which she did not tell him for some weeks until he asked why Hazel, and she told him, and he went very still for a moment, and then came and kissed her in the middle of the yard with the afternoon sun full on both of them. In August, she told him she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the coffee between them and the east light doing what it did, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, a kind of flooding happiness that he had no practiced response for, that simply moved through him openly. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and his thumb moved over her mother's ring where it sat on her right hand, the way he did sometimes, absently and with great care. "Florence," he said, and that was all just her name, but it was the whole sentence. "Yes," she said, which was also everything. The pregnancy settled into the fabric of their life, with the same steadiness that everything did when it was real and rooted. Florence continued working the garden and helping Agnes at the hotel 1 day a week and riding Hazel at a reduced pace, and the months moved forward through the cooling fall and into the second winter on the 40 acres, which was gentler than the first had been, or perhaps simply felt gentler, because they were 2 people now with a fire between them and the certain knowledge of a third one coming in the spring. She thought about her mother constantly in those months, not with grief but with a continuous quiet conversation. What Florence Lockhart would have said about the garden, what she would have thought of Samuel, how she would have prepared for the child. Florence had her mother's practicality and her mother's capacity for joy in small things, and she found she was grateful for both inheritances with a new and specific depth. In December, Hattie Marsh organized a small gathering of the women of Redemption Creek, which Florence attended, and she came home with a quilt that 6 women had made together for the coming child, pieced in blues and golds and greens, and she sat on the edge of the bed with it in her lap for a long time before she could put it away properly. Samuel came in from the barn and found her sitting there with the quilt, and her expression was the expression of someone feeling too many things at once, and he sat down beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and they sat together until the fire needed attention. "This town is good to us," Florence said eventually. "It is," Samuel agreed. "I've been here 7 years and I always knew it was a decent place, but I didn't always know it in the way I do now." "What changed?" He considered her. "You," he said. "You made me see it as a place to have a life in rather than a place to work through." She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the particular completeness of that, the way you feel when something you feared might be too good turns out to be simply true. Their son was born in March of 1880, on a cold, clear morning with a sky so blue it looked like the answer to something. The Dr. Beaumont was there, and Agnes Vickers, who had insisted on being present in the capacity of someone who would not be leaving, and Samuel, who had been awake since midnight and whose calm competence in the face of his own terror Florence found deeply impressive and very touching. The baby was healthy and loud and insistent, with a full head of dark hair and Samuel's hazel eyes already, or Florence thought so, though Beaumont said it was too early to tell. They named him Thomas Elliot Rhodes, Thomas for the honest plain quality of it, and Elliot for Samuel's father, who had died the previous year back in Ohio, and who Samuel had written about with the restrained grief of men of that time who did not always know how to say the large things directly. Florence held Thomas Elliot Rhodes in the morning light of the cabin and felt the gold ring on her right hand and thought, "Mother, look at this. Look at what we made from what you gave me." The years that followed were full and good, and real in all the ways that matter most. They were not without difficulty. A dry summer in 1880 that stressed the herd and required selling 2 animals to keep the rest fed through the winter. A fever that Thomas had at 8 months that kept Florence awake for 4 days and left her and Samuel both shaken and deeply grateful when it broke cleanly. A dispute with a neighboring claim in 1881 that required Samuel to spend 2 weeks in court at Elko, and that Florence managed the ranch through by herself with Gregory, the opinionated mule, and a great deal of coffee, and the steady company of her own capable nature. But there was also the kitchen garden, which by its 2nd year was producing more than they needed, and from which Florence began supplying the hotel, a small arrangement that became a genuine piece of their income. There was the day in the late summer of 1881 when they had 14 calves, and Samuel stood at the pasture fence counting them with the particular satisfaction of a man watching his patient work compound. And Florence stood beside him with Thomas on her hip, and thought that this was exactly what her mother had meant by something that lasts. There was the way Samuel read, once she had convinced him to stop treating it as a luxury, which was with the same complete attention he brought to everything, lying on the porch in the evenings when the light permitted or by the fire in winter, and the conversations those books produced, long, ranging, sometimes arguing and always interesting, which were some of the best hours of her adult life. There was the morning Thomas said a clear sentence at 18 months, his first, which was more or less pointing at Gregory the mule and saying, "What is that?" in a tone of profound suspicion, which made Samuel laugh for a full minute, and Florence record in the small journal she kept, which was filling steadily with the record of this life she was building. There was the afternoon in the fall of 1881 when Florence stood in the kitchen garden in the long gold light and realized that Redemption Creek had been her home for 3 years and that she could not imagine anywhere else being home, that the thing she had told Samuel in the beginning, that she carried her home with her rather than leaving it in a place, had been true, but that it was also true that now her home was here, specifically here. On these 40 acres with the weather-tight cabin and the east-facing window, and the man who had built it slowly and with intention, 1 stone and 1 board at a time. She walked into the kitchen and found Samuel at the table going through the accounts, which he did on Friday evenings with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. And she stood in the doorway and looked at him in the lamp light, the familiar line of his shoulders, the way he held his pen, the way his hair still needed cutting and probably always would, and felt something so full and certain that it had no useful name beyond its own obvious truth. He looked up and saw her expression and set down the pen. "What is it?" he said. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "I was just looking at you." He regarded her with those changing hazel eyes. And I am so glad," Florence said, "that you came out of that stage office door." He was quiet for a moment, and then he pushed back from the table and held out his hand, and she came and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the lamplight of the kitchen he had built, with their sleeping son in the next room and the Nevada night outside the window, large and cold and full of stars. "I'm glad you came on that stage," he said, "even though it was for the wrong reason. Even though it was for a man who didn't deserve it." "It was the right reason," Florence said. "I was ready for something real. I just needed to find it." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, gently, with the completeness of a man who has arrived somewhere he intends to stay. She wore her mother's ring every day, on her right hand beside the silver wedding band on her left. The two rings had become part of how she understood herself. The gold inherited one carrying the past, the silver chosen one carrying the future, and between them her own hands doing the present work of the life she had built. In the spring of 1882, the 40 acres became 60 acres when the piece to the east came available. The previous owner, an older miner who had tried cattle and decided he preferred silver, sold it to Samuel at a fair price and shook hands on the porch and rode east toward Elko. The additional land extended their pasture considerably, and Samuel spent the summer building a new section of fence with help from two hired hands, young men, brothers, recently arrived from Missouri, hardworking and good-humored. Florence liked the older brother, whose name was Frank, for his seriousness, and she liked the younger one, whose name was Danny, for his tendency to make Thomas laugh by pretending to be various animals with considerable conviction. She fed them both well and thought that they would do all right in the West if they kept their heads and their work ethic, and she told them so in the direct way she had inherited from her mother, and they seemed to find it more encouraging than presumptuous, which she thought said well of them. The new land meant they could expand the herd to 30 head, which they did gradually over the next 2 years, buying carefully, building towards something with the same patient intention Samuel had always brought to the place. In the summer of 1882, Florence discovered she was expecting again. She told Samuel in the same East morning light way she had told him the first time, and his face did the same thing, that flooding openness that he had no practiced response for, and she thought she could watch that particular face for the rest of her life without ever tiring of it. Their second child was a daughter, born in February of 1883, on a day when the snow lay quiet on the creek stones and the world was very white and still. They named her Eleanor, for Florence's mother, which was Florence's idea and which Samuel agreed to without hesitation. And when Florence said the name for the first time in the cabin with the baby in her arms, she felt her mother's presence so clearly that it was almost a sound. Eleanor was a different creature from Thomas from the first day, quieter, more observant, given to studying everything with large dark eyes that were entirely her own, and given to laughing suddenly and completely at things that no one else had noticed were funny. She was the light of the cabin in a different way than Thomas was, who was all loud forward motion and enthusiasm. Eleanor was the light that made the corners visible. Thomas took to her with the proprietary affection of a 3-year-old who has decided on a position and will hold it against all comers. He sat beside her in the rocking cradle Samuel had made and told her things in a low, confidential murmur that Florence could never quite make out, which she suspected was just as well. The family of 4 settled into the new version of itself that winter, the cabin both full and adequate, the east light coming in every morning over 2 small heads and 2 cups of coffee and the accounts book and the growing library and the life that was exactly what it had been built to be. By 1884, Redemption Creek had grown. A new rail stop had been established 15 miles east, which brought more traffic and more commerce through the town, and Agnes Vickers had expanded the hotel to 12 rooms, which was a considerable undertaking that Florence consulted on with genuine pleasure. Hattie Marsh's school had doubled in enrollment. There were 2 new businesses on the main street, and the saloon had become more orderly under new ownership, which most of the town considered an improvement. Samuel's ranch, their ranch, as Florence had begun to think of it without entirely deciding to, had become one of the steadier operations in the valley. Not the largest, not the flashiest, but known for good stock and fair dealing, which was exactly the reputation Samuel had intended from the beginning. Florence's kitchen garden had expanded to a proper market garden by this point, supplying the hotel, the general store's produce section, and a number of individual households in the regular way of someone who had made a small business from something that started as household sufficiency. She kept meticulous records and grew things with a combination of her mother's practical instinct and her own determined experimental spirit, trying new varieties, learning what the high desert soil would and would not support, adjusting year by year with the patience of someone who understands that the long game is the only game worth playing. She also began writing a regular column for the Elko newspaper that covered practical farming and household management for frontier women, which she did on Sunday afternoons when the house was reasonably quiet. It was her own idea, and she had simply sent the first one to the editor without asking whether it was wanted, which was the approach her mother would have endorsed. The editor ran it and asked for more and paid her a small fee per column, which she found particularly satisfying not for its size but for its meaning, that she was being paid for the knowledge she had built from her own experience, and that the experience was worth something beyond the boundaries of her own land. Samuel read each column before she sent it, not to approve it but because he was interested, and he was always interested in the right ways, asking about the reasoning behind particular recommendations, noticing when she had solved a problem elegantly, occasionally pointing out a sentence that could be clearer, which she almost never agreed with but always considered carefully. They argued sometimes, the way 2 people with opinions argue when they share a space and a life and both believe in being direct. They argued about the timing of the new pasture fence. They argued about whether to buy a second mule or let Gregory do the work alone, which Florence thought was unkind to Gregory, and Samuel thought Florence was anthropomorphizing a mule, and Florence said that even if she was, kindness was kindness, and they got a second mule, whom Thomas named Walter, and Samuel admitted by July that Walter was indeed useful. They argued once seriously about whether to send Thomas to the school in Elko when he turned 7, which would have meant boarding in town during the weeks, and Florence felt very strongly that Thomas was too young for that, and Samuel felt equally strongly that the Elko school was better than the Redemption Creek school, and that it would serve Thomas better in the long term. They held this disagreement for 3 days without resolving it, each of them being careful not to simply capitulate, until Samuel came in one evening from the barn and sat down across the table from her and said, "Tell me exactly why you believe what you believe." And she did, fully and clearly, and he listened with his complete attention and then said, "I think you're right. I was thinking about his future education, and you were thinking about him right now, and both matter but yours matters more at 7. And that was that." She loved him most, she thought, in moments like that, not in the easy agreement or the large romantic gestures, but in the moments when he chose to truly hear her, when he let her change his mind because she had reasoned it through properly. Thomas was sent to the Redemption Creek School, where he was tiresome in the way of very bright children in classrooms too small for their energy, which Hattie Marsh managed with the practiced patience of a woman who had taught on the frontier for 15 years. Thomas came home every afternoon full of opinions and questions, and Florence answered as many as she could directly, and sent him to Samuel for the rest. And Samuel answered them all with the same seriousness he brought to adult conversation, which Thomas received as his natural due, and which Florence thought was exactly the right way to talk to a child who would grow into a man. Eleanor, when she started school 2 years later, was quieter in class but read 2 grade levels ahead by her first year, which delighted Hattie Marsh and surprised no one who knew Eleanor, who had been carefully studying everything she encountered since approximately the first week of her life. In the spring of 1886, Florence turned 32 and Samuel turned 36, and they had been married 7 years, and Florence thought that 7 years of real marriage, the kind with both the difficulty and the deep pleasure in full measure, was worth more than most people's entire lives, and she said as much to Agnes Vickers over coffee one morning, who replied that she had been married once briefly, before the man in question had died of a snake bite in '61, and that she had not entirely recovered from the loss, and that Florence Lockhart Rhodes was doing the right thing by knowing her own good fortune. Florence had known Agnes Vickers well enough by now to know that this was one of the few times the hotel keeper had mentioned her husband unprompted, and she touched the woman's hand across the coffee cups and said, "He would have been proud of what you've made of this place." And Agnes looked at her over her spectacles with eyes that were bright and did not say anything, which meant she agreed. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that tested every ranch in the valley. The creek dropped low, and the pasture browned early, and hay had to be brought in from further away at higher cost, and Samuel made careful decisions about the herd that spring, selling animals he had planned to keep in order to preserve the core stock, a calculation that required weighing present cost against future recovery, with the particular cold clarity of someone who loves a thing and must nevertheless treat it practically. Florence managed the water for the kitchen garden with the obsessive precision of someone who had learned what high desert plants need, and refused to let her work die if there was any alternative. She rigged additional storage barrels and adjusted her planting accordingly, and accepted losses in some sections to save others. And by September, while neighbors' gardens had largely failed, hers was producing at reduced but functional levels. The drought broke in September with a week of rain that was the most welcome sound Florence had ever heard on a roof, and the creek rose and the pasture began to come back, and the mood of the valley lifted in the particular way it lifts when the thing that was threatening simply stops. That fall, walking the recovered pasture with Samuel on a gold October afternoon, with Thomas and Eleanor running ahead of them chasing whatever children chase in open fields, Florence reached over and took his hand in the same way she had on that February road 7 years earlier, and he turned his hand and held hers in the same way he had then. "We came through it," she said. "We did," he said. "We always will." She looked at him sideways in the October light. "That's a large promise." "I'm a man who keeps his promises," Samuel said simply. She smiled and squeezed his hand. "I know." They walked on through the gold afternoon, the children running ahead, the mountains steady at the edge of the world, the 60 acres of good land spreading out around them under a sky so large it held everything. In the evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, Florence sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her journal, and she wrote. She had been keeping the journal since the spring after their marriage, recording the events and observations and reflections of the life she was building, not for any reader but for the simple discipline of looking at things closely. She had filled 3 volumes by now and was well into a 4th. She wrote about the drought and the recovery. She wrote about Thomas's current obsession with horses, which was becoming less an obsession and more a genuine early competence that Samuel was carefully fostering with the patience he brought to all instruction. She wrote about Eleanor, who had that week asked Florence to explain where rain came from, and had received a full scientific explanation from her mother that she had then taken to school and presented to Hattie Marsh as her own discovery, which Hattie Marsh had very wisely decided to count as original thinking. She wrote about the ring on her right hand, which had been on her hand through 7 years of hard Western living and was now further worn, the carved rose barely visible but present if you looked closely, and how she felt about wearing it, that it was both her mother's history and her own, that the love it represented had continued in the way her mother had meant when she had pressed it into Florence's hand in Memphis. She wrote about Samuel, which she did at the end of most entries, in a sentence or two, recording something specific, what he had said that day, what she had noticed about him, one particular true thing. She did this because she was aware, with the precise awareness of someone who has lost people she loved, that you must keep the record of the ordinary days because the ordinary days are the whole thing, and that the large moments and the celebrations are supported entirely by the weight of the unremarkable days that constitute a life together. He came in from the barn, where he had been checking on a cow that had seemed off her feed, and sat across from her with his own cup of coffee. The lamp burned between them. "She's fine," he said, "just unsettled by the cold front." "I thought so," Florence said. He looked at her across the table with a small smile. "You usually do." She closed the journal and set it aside. "Sit with me," she said. "Just sit." He sat with her, and the fire shifted in the stove, and the children slept in the next room, and the Nevada night was cold and clear and full of stars beyond the window, and Florence Lockhart Rhodes sat in the kitchen her husband had built on the land he had worked stone by stone and board by board and decision by careful decision, with her mother's ring on her right hand and her own life on her left, and felt the particular completeness of a person who has found exactly what she was looking for in the place she never expected to find it. She had been 24 years old, dusty and unbelieving, standing in the red street of Redemption Creek with a ring in her pocket and a dead promise behind her, and she had walked toward the hotel because there was nothing else to do, and a man had come out of a stage office door and said, "I know where he is," and then had given her the truth instead, which was the better thing by an immeasurable distance. She had not found George Calloway. She had found something real, which was better than finding what she had come looking for, because what she had come looking for had been only the idea of a life, and what she found instead was the actual thing, with all its weight and texture and specific daylight, and the particular smell of coffee in a well-built kitchen, and the sound of a good man moving through the world with steady, honest purpose. In the years that followed those early ones, the years that stretched through the late 1880s and into the turn of what would eventually be a new century, though Florence could not know that yet, the life on the 60 acres continued to grow and deepen in all the ways that good things do when they are properly tended. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's deliberate hands and his mother's directness, and by 14, he was a genuine help with the horses, and by 16, Samuel was teaching him the cattle decisions with the same careful instruction he had given everything else. He was not always easy. He had a streak of stubbornness that Florence recognized as coming equally from both parents, but he was good, fundamentally and reliably good, in the way that matters most. Alina grew into a young woman of unusual clarity, who read everything she could find and asked questions that kept both her parents sharp, and who had at 15 declared that she intended to be a schoolteacher like Hattie Marsh, whom she had adored since age 6, and Florence had looked at her daughter saying this with the expression of someone seeing something that had been there all along suddenly in full resolution, and had said, "Then we'll see to it," and meant it. Agnes Vickers had a stroke in the winter of 1889 and spent 6 weeks at the Rhodes Ranch convalescing, because Florence had insisted, and Agnes had been in no condition to argue and secretly pleased not to have to. She recovered most of her function, though she moved more slowly and handed off more of the hotel management after that. Florence helped her find a capable young couple from Carson City to manage the day-to-day. And Agnes continued as owner and authority, but reduced her hours, and came to the Rhodes ranch for Sunday dinner most weeks, which she and Florence both pretended was a casual arrangement rather than the fixed and necessary appointment it had become. Hattie Marsh retired from the school in 1891, and Florence organized a proper farewell for her, the whole town filling the hotel dining room as it had for so many occasions. And Hattie stood at the front of the room looking at the community she had helped build and cried with no apparent embarrassment. And Florence stood in the back with Samuel's arm around her and felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who has been part of something real. The town of Redemption Creek had been, for Florence Lockhart Rhodes, the site of arrival and disappointment and recovery and love and building and community, and all the years of ordinary days that make a life. And she had come to feel for it the particular love you feel for a place that has held you at your most vulnerable and given you the chance to become more than you were. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off that stage in September of 1878, rode dusty and composed and carrying her mother's ring and the whole weight of a failed promise. She thought about that woman with great tenderness, the way you think about an earlier version of yourself who didn't know yet what was coming, who was holding on to dignity in a difficult moment, without knowing that the difficult moment was not the destination but the passage. The passage had brought her here, to the kitchen with the east window and the fire, and the man who had built the cabinet shelves with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and to the garden that produced reliably in the high desert because she had learned its requirements, and to the two children who were hers in the way that nothing theoretical could prepare you for, and to the gold ring on her right hand that carried her mother's love forward into a life Eleanor Lockhart would have recognized as what she meant. Samuel came in one spring morning in 1892, the spring that Thomas was 12 and Eleanor 9, with a letter in his hand that he set on the kitchen table beside the coffee cups with the expression of a man who had read something that required careful handling. Florence looked at the letter and then at him. "What is it?" "It's from a lawyer in Elko," he said. "A man named Calloway died in Arizona last month, left considerable debts. The lawyer is notifying anyone who might have a claim against the estate." He paused. "The name is George Calloway." Florence considered this for a moment. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the east light on the table. She thought about the man she had ridden 4 states to find, who had ridden south with a saloon woman and debts and bad faith, who had been dissolving through the West on charm and borrowed credit for 14 years, and who had apparently reached the end of whatever road that was. She felt nothing in particular. Not grief, not satisfaction, not relief. Only the mild completion of something that had been so thoroughly superseded that its ending was more bookkeeping than event. "Well," she said, "I have no claim against his estate." "No," Samuel agreed. "Neither do I now that the wages are well past statute. Then we don't need to respond to this." "No," he said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. "How is the gray mare this morning? I thought she was favoring her left front yesterday." And they went on. Because the life goes on, which is the point of it, which is the whole extraordinary, ordinary fact of it. In June of 1892, Samuel turned 40 and Florence organized, with Agnes Vickers' considerable conspiratorial delight, a gathering at the ranch that managed to be both a surprise and a complete success, which in Florence's estimation was a logistical miracle. The whole community came. It seemed the Whitmore family, Joe Pratt from the general store, the Dr. Beaumont who was 81 and had recently refused to retire, Hattie Marsh with her knitting, the hired hands Frank and Danny who were still in the valley and had both married and were farming their own small places east of town. Samuel stood in the yard of his 60-acre ranch, the ranch he had built from 40 acres and a weather-tight cabin, and a vision he had described to Florence on a February afternoon as something worth having, and looked at the people filling his yard, and then looked at Florence across the crowd, with an expression she would write about later that evening in her journal at considerable length, trying to capture it exactly. She had captured it eventually like this. He looked at her the way a man looks at the source of the best part of his life, with recognition and gratitude, and a love so established it had become structural, like the stone fireplace and the east-facing window and the 60 acres, and all the accumulated honest work between them. She crossed the yard to him through the gathered town and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she put her hand on his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and present. And she thought, Mother, here is the love that keeps going. Here is the love that lasts. Here is the life made from the one you gave me and the one I chose and the long road between Memphis, and here that I would ride again at any cost because this is where it brought me. The gold ring was on her right hand. The silver band was on her left. The June sun was on the Nevada land, and the creek was running clear between its stones, and the mountains held the edge of the world in their blue, steady way. And somewhere in the yard, Thomas was telling his sister some piece of information with great authority that a leaner was receiving with polite skepticism. And Agnes Vickers was laughing at something Frank had said. And Hattie Marsh was watching everything with the satisfied expression of a woman seeing the fruits of a long investment. Samuel bent his head and said quietly into her hair, "Thank you for this." "Thank your stage driver," Florence said. "He's the one who brought me." "I'll thank the man I see every morning," Samuel said. She tilted her head up to look at him, and he kissed her there in the yard in front of the hole of Redemption Creek, which was a small scandal and no scandal at all. And she kissed him back in the complete and easy way of two people who have been kissing each other for 14 years, and have not, in all that time, lost the sense that it means something. The crowd made a sound of communal approval that was largely indistinguishable from amusement, and Thomas said something from across the yard that made a leaner cover her eyes with her hand, in the theatrical way of a 9-year-old confronting the behavior of parents, and Agnes Vickers laughed again. And the afternoon moved forward the way all good afternoons do, towards supper and more conversation, and the late Nevada light going gold on the mountains, and the creek murmuring its way south past the garden Florence had built from high desert soil and sheer determined will. Later, much later, when the guests had gone and the children were asleep and the yard was quiet and the last of the June light was gone, Florence and Samuel sat on the porch as they had sat on 100 evenings, side by side, the night coming in cool and clear around them. The stars were doing what the Nevada stars always did, which was everything. She had her mother's ring between her thumb and forefinger, turning it the way she did in quiet moments, feeling the carved rose that was barely there anymore but still present, still felt. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, in the low, unhurried voice that was still, after all these years, one of her favorite sounds. "About the stage," Florence said. "About that first day, about you coming out of that doorway." "I nearly didn't come out," he said. "I had told myself it wasn't my concern, that whatever she found was not my business." Florence looked at him. "What changed your mind?" He was quiet for a moment, considering it as he considered everything fully. "I thought about what it would be like," he said, "to arrive somewhere alone on the strength of a promise that wasn't kept. And I thought that would be a hard thing, and that saying nothing was a kind of cruelty I didn't want to be responsible for." "So it was mercy," Florence said. "At first," he said, "and then it was you." She let go of the ring and took his hand. He held it in both of his, the way he did sometimes, warming it. The creek ran south. The stars were infinite and indifferent and beautiful. The cabin behind them held all the evidence of a life built deliberately and well, all the small chosen things and the years of ordinary days that made the weight of it real. "Samuel," Florence said. "Florence," he said, which was still, as it had always been, a complete sentence. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch of what they had made, in the particular silence of two people who have said everything important and continue to say it anyway, with their hands and their days and their steady presence, and the long, unbroken line of all the ordinary mornings coming east through the window over coffee, and into whatever the next good year would bring. The ring on her right hand held its small carved rose, barely visible now, worn almost smooth by 30-some years of her mother's wearing and then her own, carrying forward the love it had been given to carry, which was the love that kept going, the love that lasted, the love that Florence Lockhart had brought across 4 states in the lining of a coat, and found waiting for her not in the man she came for, but in the one who came out of a stage office door and said, "I know where he is," and gave her the truth instead. Which was, it turned out, the whole of it, which was all she had ever needed, which was everything.